Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm really looking forward to hosting tonight's conversation between writers and organizers David Camfield and Cynthia Kaufman to celebrate the release of Camfield's new book, Future on Fire: Capitalism and the Politics of Climate Change. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina. We're an anarchist collective that specializes in titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. Firestorm is also a community event space. However, due to the ongoing pandemic, we continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. With that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. One that might be relevant to folks who are here tonight is on Sunday, October 30th. We'll host anarchist writer Peter Gelderloos to discuss his latest book, The Solutions Are Already Here: Strategies of Ecological Revolution from Below. So if you're interested in signing up for that or any other event happening through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. And for those of you who are here tonight in the live audience, our speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you're interested in asking anything at any point, I'll just encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the Facebook live stream. Great. Moving on to tonight's speakers. David Camfield teaches labor studies and sociology at the University of Manitoba and has been involved in social justice efforts since high school. He is the author of We Can Do Better: Ideas for Changing Society, and Canadian Labor in Crisis: Reinventing the Workers' Movement. Cynthia Kaufman is the director of the Vasconcelos Institute for Democracy in Action, where she also teaches community organizing and philosophy. She is the author of The Sea is Rising, and So Are We, and is a lifelong activist working on issues like tenants' rights, police abuse, union organizing, international politics, and climate change. So David, Cynthia, thanks so much for taking the time to be here tonight and share your thoughts and your insights. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here. And yeah, super big respect for your collective and the work that you all do. So I wanted to just start by asking David, why did you write the book?
Thanks.
Meaning, and part of that is like, what do you hope it accomplishes?
Okay, so first, in terms of why did I write it? Well, I was, thinking about some of these kinds of things for some time, and then I was able, because of my job, to teach a course which was touching on some of it, and this was in 2018, 2019, and then in 2019, in the city where I live, in Winnipeg, there was a lot of participation in the mobilization for the global climate strike, the student strike in September. And Winnipeg is a very cold city for much of the year. And that means that in the summer, when it's really nice, people don't generally go to political meetings, organizing meetings and that kind of thing. And I found myself there were lots and lots of people, including lots of people I didn't know, showing up at meetings on summer evenings in Winnipeg, which began to tell me something was shifting. And I'm sure this was happening in lots of other places that people here were as well noticing, if you were involved in climate organizing in 2019. And there was so much enthusiasm and excitement around that, but I thought that there were a lot of weaknesses in the understanding of the problem and thinking about strategy, especially, that I was encountering in that. And so I thought something that I could try to contribute to the movement that was clearly emerging was a book like the one I ended up writing. So that's how I came to write it. And since I'm very fortunate to have a job that allows me to, write on paid time, that was something I felt that I could do to contribute, informed by my experience as well as, my reading and thinking about some of the analytical questions. And in terms of what I hope it accomplishes, well, it's trying to give what I hope is a rigorous analysis in a really accessible way to people. So it's something that's, because it's a short book for people who are busy and have lots of demands on their time. It's meant as a kind of introduction, not necessarily an introduction to the issue of climate change, but introduction to thinking about climate change in relation to capitalism and some of the issues that throws up for people who want climate justice. So that's, I'm hoping it's the kind of book that will lead people to want to learn more, certainly, and that will not be something that's intimidating, because there's a lot of really great analysis, of some of those issues around capitalism and the climate crisis and capitalism and the broader ecological crisis, but some of it can be a little bit difficult if you don't have the background in the theory, and so on. So I'm hoping it kind of avoids that hurdle, but acts as a gateway drug to lots of other kinds of writing people have done. And I'm hoping that it's something that people who are involved in climate justice work will find useful, even though the movement certainly in northern North America is at a very different point now than it was in 2019 when I originally conceived it.
Could I say, I want to say that, yeah, I really loved reading your book, and I want to recommend it to anybody listening, that it does accomplish what David just said, which is it's very accessible, but it digs pretty deeply and in a good, meaty, solid way into that question of the relationship between the climate crisis and capitalism. And I just want to say, in terms of my own book, that feels really important. So my book I wrote it, it's a kind of everything you need if you have sort of a radical-ish mindset to get involved in the climate movement. So my book is more sort of comprehensive in that sense. It's just like, what is the climate crisis? What are people doing? What can they do? How to deal with your own emotional kind of difficulties around being upfront and personal with the climate crisis all the time. So it's sort of, my book is much more comprehensive, but when you get into that specific narrow question about capitalism and the climate crisis, I just want to say, I think that that's one of the most important questions. And the reason I think that is that there's so many, the dominant mainstream narrative about the climate crisis is that we're going to solve it with the market, and we're going to solve it with technology, and don't you worry your pretty little head, it'll all be fine, And so I think what folks who are coming from where the work like David and mine, and so what we call the climate justice movement, is there are deeply entrenched political and economic interests that are the reason we're not making progress. So I just think that for me, that's like the core of what I think is important, and what you and I have as overlap is that sense that we've got to take the sort of the role of capitalism super seriously in dealing with the crisis.
Yeah, thanks for that. It makes me interested. I don't know how many people are watching and where people are exactly, but I'm interested, Cynthia, in your sense about where things are at in the US in terms of climate-related organizing, both in general and more specifically the climate justice wing of the movement.
Yeah,
because
it's funny because I kind of feel like it's terrible. In some way, one has to say it's terrible because the problem is so urgent. We need to be doing so much. I think probably all of us here feel like we need to have millions of people on the street, raising hell and shutting the system down to the extent possible. And that's absolutely not happening almost anywhere in the world, as far as I know right now, around the climate. And so that's like the first answer to your question, is like, it's nowhere near what it should be. And yet I think in the US, it's interesting. I read some things about the sort of the state of the conversation in Britain recently, and I was like, oh, at least we're not that bad off. And what I mean by that is that I feel like for the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, I feel like the climate justice folk are sort of beginning to win the battle for hegemony. So what I mean by that is sort of like what's people's common sense understanding of what's going on and what we're supposed to do about it. If you go back like 5 or 6 years, there was this sort of personal carbon footprint thing, the sort of like, oh, each person needs to do their own consumer, whatever. And I've been really involved in the divestment movement. And some people say, well, that doesn't do anything because it doesn't change the price of stocks, et cetera, et cetera. It's a sort of weird, wonky thing. But the reason I've been doing divestment work for all these years is we have to blame the fossil fuel companies. We have to make them the target and the bad guy in this narrative. And I feel like that's starting to shift, where I do think that a lot of people who do climate work now know that that we're up against an incredibly powerful, well-funded, deeply entrenched set of opponents who have a tremendous amount of political and economic power, and that's who we're fighting against. So in my sense is that the climate, that idea of climate justice, which is seeing it in those political economic terms, that perspective is becoming bigger, stronger, deeper, broader. And so everywhere I go, I see people who I don't have to make that case as strongly as I used to. In California, we just had, there's a whole lot of, we're a petro state, right? And people don't think of us that way, but California is in fact a petro state. And there was a really great movement of a lot of environmental justice groups over the last few years to stop drilling from happening near schools and where people live. And, and a huge amount of action and work on the street and, inside the state lobbying, all, a really broad group of mostly folks from low-income communities of color got something through to stop that. And I also do a lot of work with youth organizations, and there's still one of the groups we're in alliance with is called Youth versus Apocalypse. And they're, mostly high school folk who are just like out there all the time doing really powerful work saying this is unacceptable. So I think the consciousness is starting to shift, but we're nowhere near where we need to be, is what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I was certainly struck. It's difficult for me to kind of get a read on this now in the context of the Canadian state where I am, but certainly the real popularity of the slogans around system change, not climate change, and of what I would call a kind of maybe a shallow anti-capitalism. It could, like the basic idea that there's a connection, that capitalism is the cause. You see this expressed in different kinds of slogans. I think that's, especially among young people, definitely more widely held than it has ever been before. There may not be a lot of depth to an understanding of capitalism, but I think because of, for some people, the deeper politicization that's happened since the pandemic began, there have been some people who've just on their own been, even if they haven't been involved in big protests, because there haven't been things happening so much since late 2019. Although, I mean, that there are obviously some places, but certainly obviously in the US with the size of the uprising in summer of 2020, some of the same people who did climate protests in late 2019 probably were on the streets quite a lot in 2020. But so some of those people have continued to, with their own learning and thinking about this. But since there haven't been big climate focused mobilizations, the dynamic has been pretty different.
Yeah. I want to ask you, what do you like, your book is really, it's about the climate crisis and capitalism. And there's one piece of this that you just said, which is that like, when people really climate change, the climate crisis is helping a lot of people get politicized and see the problems with capitalism. So long-term, that's going to be great for us anti-capitalists. But I want to flip that around the other side of it, which is, why do you think it's important for people who are in the climate movement to have a deep understanding of capitalism?
Right. Okay. Well, I think that it is very important to understand what we're up against, to understand the problem. And then that ultimately is important for informing our strategy for what we do, but it's also important for people to understand the challenges we face and what we're likely to experience, because in terms of how we think about our own expectations, I guess, around just like living with this gathering, there's a present threat and a gathering and increasing threat. And so I think there's both those two aspects to it. And I think there are lots of ways in which understanding that, for example, capitalism is I would say an inherently ecocidal way of organizing society, in that it is driven, to expand constantly. So there's a relentless way that competition forces the accumulation of capital to happen in a way where the speed of accumulation and the scale are limitless, and ever trying to accelerate both as much as possible. And that just is very damaging, overwhelms the buffering systems of nature. And so that means that there's something about the way the system works. It's inherently that way. The popular slogan, "The system's not broken, it was built this way," kind of gets at that insight. So I think that's one thing. And just understanding that capitalism is driven by competition to prioritize profit, which is a very short-term, thing. Even though the implications in the longer term may be bad for capital itself, for business, for the capitalist class, and of course for humanity. But the relentless short-term focus on profits is not it's not accidental. It's part of how capitalism works. And so we could say that capitalism has a kind of irrational logic that drives firms and states, to the extent that they're driven by what by the competitive forces, to act in ways that are the rational in the short-term logic of capital way for firms, but irrational for humanity in a broader sense. So it's not, there is a logic to it. We can understand it. It's not it's not random in any way. And I think the third thing I'll say is that I think we should understand that the state power, the way that it exists, is actually part of capitalism. I think that instead of thinking of capitalism as an economic system in a kind of narrow sense, it's actually better to think about it as a way of organizing society as a whole in many different ways. And so that state power is actually inside of capitalism, not outside of it. And that can help us think about, it helps us understand why states do what they are doing, or why they're not doing, different things, and also can relate to what people might choose to do strategically in relation to demands that they put on governments and action that they would take. So I don't think the state is a neutral set of institutions in this kind of society. So it's not just a state in a capitalist society, but I would say it's a capitalist state. And so I think if we understand those kinds of realities, it can help people who want to take action for climate justice to develop better strategy. And also, if we understand the depth of the problem, it does, it's very, very sobering. I mean, it can be extremely upsetting for people to really grapple with the implications of understanding this. But I think that is ultimately better to really have a good grasp of social reality than not, because it will lead us to have more grounded expectations about the challenges that we face, and we have to live our lives while we're working for the kind of change that's needed. And I do think that it never helps us in the long run. If we want to be in the struggle for the long haul, it's never helpful to have analysis that's weak or built on wishful expectations.
Yeah, I just want to pause there for a second, because that's super sobering what you just said and the way you just said it. It's funny. I have another book I wrote many years ago called Getting Past Capitalism. And one of the things I argue in that book is that there are ways that we on the left, anti-capitalists, think about the nature of capitalism that can be somewhat self-defeating when it comes to organizing. And so I just want to say, I agree with so much of what you just said. And it's like, if it's the case, that, and I think there's a place that you and I maybe have some disagreements that might be fun to dig into, to what extent should one engage with the state? I just wanted to say that I think there's some rich conversation to be had there. It's like, yes, capitalism is ecocidal. It's not random. The state is part of the capitalist system. And if you understand all those things, I think a lot of anti-capitalists then say, okay, so all we can do is sit back and wait for the thing to crash. Right. Right. And it's sort of like there's an old tradition in the among anti-capitalists that's kind of like that says the only thing you can do is a revolution, and you can't make a revolution happen. You have to wait till the conditions are ripe. And so a lot of time anti-capitalists actually are very, I think as an activist, counterproductive, where they're like, yeah, let's make things worse before they get better. And anything you do to make things better, and I know you don't believe this, I'm just queuing this up for you, and anything you do to make things better, that's just reformist, right? And so I don't believe in any of that. And so I'm just wondering, like, how you make sense of that kind of ball of complexity.
Yeah, those are really great points. So thanks for bringing them up. I think that the question is, how do we have an understanding of the nature of capitalism that doesn't lead to, that kind of folding your hands and sitting back? Because, first of all, that it's not like, I don't think capitalism is going to just, fall off the cliff or something like that, the way that might, there's all sorts of ways in which capitalism creates profound crises, and there's good reason to think that these are going to get worse. But it's not somehow just going to break down and then there's going to be some spontaneous development of a new and better society at all. There's all sorts of ways in which capitalist society could fall into really profound crises. And crisis is an overused word, so I think there's a risk.
But it's a time for it.
Yeah, but or the way in which we can come back to that. But I think that it's not somehow just going to spontaneously give birth to something else. And there are ways in which profound crises in capitalist societies can lead to unbelievably murderous and destructive outcomes, and potentially new ways of organizing society that are worse, could happen. And so I think that, to have a crisis of capitalist society that leads to the development of a better society, that's only going to happen if you have enormous numbers of people who are in motion working for that kind of a society, so that this crisis of the society leads to a different kind of an outcome. And that's going to be shaped in all sorts of kind of non-linear ways by what people have been doing in the years and decades before that. And I think it's so important to think about that in terms of what can be done to foster people's self-activity. So all the different kinds of ways that people can organize themselves, whether that be in the workplace or in the community or in whatever way, where they are acting collectively to try to take on injustice in a way that builds their own capacities, and which is transformative for them in the process. It's both about what people achieve and about how people are changed by the process of working for change. And so I think that, far from an analysis of capitalism pointing people to just kind of a waiting for it to get worse and hoping that it's going to get worse or anything like that, it should in fact inspire people to be involved in efforts to foster self-activity, to build social movements, and to do all of those kinds of things, trying to prevent people's lives, try to act in ways that prevent people's lives from getting worse in the here and now, and wherever possible to win reforms within capitalist societies that will make things better. Because I don't think that's going to lead to people, when people win reforms, if you win, really good public transit, or if you actually manage to, expropriate from fossil fuel companies, these kinds of things are not going to lead people to decide that, well, that's an adequate solution, that's just solved all the problems. In fact, it'll raise people's horizons, and people will be inspired to do more. So I think it's in fact through struggles for social reforms that the potential for the emergence of a different society can be fostered.
I could not agree with that more. Yeah, right. And so it is that struggle for reforms about, better public transportation, cities organized in different ways, getting the fossil fuel money out of politics, all those kinds of, sort of exposing the entrenched and terrible interests, and building new alternatives. That I think that it is like, you build the road by walking, right? We are building our way toward a kind of a sustainable society through all the stepwise moves we make along the way.
I guess what I would add is that I think, and this may be an area of interesting disagreement, but I do think this, this is very important, but at the same time, I also think there's no incremental path out of capitalism. I do think that the development of a different kind of society, a better society, would have to actually involve a rupture. I do think that there's a way in which lots of changes can be achieved within the confines of a capitalist society, but that certainly the possibility of moving towards a society which is not driven by profit, but where the logic is meeting people's needs in a way that is compatible with a non-destructive relationship between humanity and the rest of nature, which is ultimately what I mean by ecosocialism when I use that term. And I think it's important to say that because that same term ecosocialism can be used to mean different things. But if we're talking about a society that's ultimately a classless and stateless society where what is produced in order to meet people's needs and to begin the process of ecological repair and so on, that kind of society, I do think, could only begin to develop as a result of a kind of a ruptural break with capitalism, but rather than somehow just an accumulation of reforms. I mean, I do think reforms are vital for people's lives and for addressing the climate crisis and other aspects of the ecological crisis, but I also do think that there's that moment of rupture that would be required to start a transition. So it's a kind of a both and, I guess. Thing.
Yeah, no, as I was reading your book, I was so interested. It's just like, oh, I agree with that. And like, that's a good way of putting that. And then when I got to your thing about like, the state is fundamentally a capitalist state, I was like, this is the place where I think you and I probably have disagreement. And I do think that that this is a space to kind of stretch and pull on that, because I actually think it's really an interesting conversation. Because, when I wrote my book on capitalism, one of the things I was really interested in that question. It was like I had sort of grown up as, I got politicized in 1980 around U.S. support for the dictatorships in Central America. And so, so I'm fully, on board with the revolutions that were happening there. And I always thought like, oh, and so I've been anti-capitalist since I've been political. And yet so many anti-capitalists who I run across have that pessimism that I was talking about before. And so I was like, let me understand this idea of like the need for a rupture, And so I spent a bunch of years just reading on that question and thinking about it. And one of my favorite authors there's a composite author that's actually two different people, but the composite author is called J.K. Gibson Graham. And they had written a book, actually that one of them gave a talk that just blew my mind, which was basically like, if I'm an anti-racist, I know that incremental changes can lead to fundamental changes. If I'm a feminist, I know that incremental changes can lead to fundamental changes. But when I'm an anti-capitalist, I can't think that way. And why is that? And so and then there's another philosopher who I really like, Bruno Latour, who sadly died recently, who's just one of my favorite thinkers. And Latour has this really great thing on like, what do you mean by revolution, right? And what he says is, if you think of society as kind of like a matrix in a fabric, you never jump out of it, right? The fabric is always changing, which is why when you look at the sort of like socialist revolutions that become dictatorships, which I know we're in an anarchist space where nobody wants that. Everybody knows what's wrong with that. What happens in those things is you think you have a revolution, but really you had a coup d'etat, meaning you changed the people at the top. There was some pressures from below, but fundamentally the structure of society is still rather what it was before. And so that leads me then to say that we are always in a situation where there's never a fundamental move from, system A to system B, right? It's always more of this, less of that. So that's how I see it. And I agree with you that the Canadian state, the US state, many states in the world are capitalist states, meaning that they are run largely in the interest of capital. But I also see those as contested spaces where part of the work of social movements is to really push to have popular needs be met by those institutions. And so anyhow, what do you,
yeah, you bring up a lot of questions and we're going to we have a whole event on each of them. I think that on that last point, I think there's absolutely there are enormous differences between different states that exist in the world today, and I don't want to homogenize them, say that they're all, identical or something like that. There's, it's clearly different to live in the Canadian state with public health care, despite all its problems, than live in the US, right? But it's also very different to live in, one of the parts of Europe where you still have a more comprehensive broad welfare state than exists in either of these two states. And so there are lots of ways in which contesting state policy is very important. And, the kinds of demands for a Green New Deal, for example, are all about, pushing this, or in large part about pushing the state to act in certain kinds of ways. I guess the question is, one question is, does, winning social or environmental reforms change the basic character of state power or not?
Right.
And I think that there's a way in which, in a capitalist society, that state power is ultimately, the way it works is subordinated to the need to keep capitalism operating. And so that really constrains what states will do. Now, of course, what states will do is also influenced by what other forces in society are doing. So whether that's, capitalists or, exploited classes or other forces, or parts of other blocks of different social forces, will definitely affect what the state does. But I think there are limits to that. And so that's why I think that, even electing a radical left green government into office with the support of social movements would not change the basic character of the state institutions that government is part of. And then that poses all sorts of challenges and problems for that kind of a government, if it was trying to actually move to implement its agenda. So that's, and then on the broader question, I know Gibson Graham's work, and I guess one of the differences is ultimately, do we understand capitalism as an agglomeration of social practices, or do we think that there's a totalizing logic? Right. And I think that does capitalism have an essence in that way? And I come down on the side of I'm persuaded by the argument that in fact capitalism is not just a decentered agglomeration of practices that kind of could coexist with many other different economic practices, but rather, well, there's all sorts of room for different things to happen in a capitalist society. Like you can have more worker cooperatives, for example, but that there is this overarching logic that will either, as long as it's there, that's going to really constrain everything else, and that the alternative would be something other than what they call for when they talk about a proliferation of economic difference.
No, and it's interesting. So I was super influenced by their work, and then I agree with you that it doesn't sort of go all the way. So what I do in my capitalism book is like, what are the forms of agency that make what you're talking about? In other words, that make those sort of horrible capitalist things keep happening, right? And then how can we break those forms of agency? And I think that that's right. In other words, money in politics, people being dependent on a job to survive. Like there's a whole bunch of things like that. So if you sort of understand what are the things that feed the beast that is capitalism, then you understand that a lot of our work needs to be to sort of stop the feeding of those things. But I love the idea of there not being an essence, but that there being, several forms of agency. But I think now we're super into the deep philosophical weeds, so maybe let's pull ourselves back out of that. But and I super appreciate the congenial conversation on that. I wanted to add, you call yourself an eco-socialist, and I am fairly sympathetic to that. And there was a long time where I thought I wanted to call myself an eco-socialist. But I am really excited about a lot of the work in the global South that calls itself solidarity, social and solidarity economics. And one of the things I love about that is that when I imagine, so now it's like switch to like imagining that better world, right? That we're all wanting to get to. When I imagine that better world, I imagine, if you get, David Graeber has that great thing about bullshit jobs, right? A huge amount of what people spend time on is absolute garbage and totally, like a waste of time. Then there's all consumerism. If you get rid of all of that, we can meet our needs with people working very few hours, right? So one of the things, and one of the things that a lot of feminist economists focus on is the idea of the things we do to meet our needs that are not done by the market, i.e. capitalism, and they're not done by the state, i.e. traditional ideas of socialism. So one of the reasons that I've kind of been gravitating lately to solidarity economy as my ideal rather than eco-socialism is that eco-socialism for a lot of people triggers that idea of an economy managed by the state. So I just wanted to ask you about that choice of language. I think where you and I want to get to in terms of our ideal society is exactly the same.
Right. And one way of thinking about this is that there's a classic essay from the 60s by Hal Draper called The Two Souls of Socialism, in which Draper talks about socialism from above and socialism from below as these two traditions of socialism that have been coexisting, sometimes warring with each other ever since socialist politics developed out of the French Revolution. And so I find that, and so that the idea being that socialism from above involves some minority taking control of the existing state or destroying the existing state and building another one from which it then hands down, remake society from above, whether this is something that happens through the election of, particular people to office in a capitalist democracy, or whether it involves, an armed seizure of power. Whatever the root is, that those are just different variations of socialism from above, and whether it's a guerrilla army or a political party that you elect, there's whatever the difference is, there's a shared logic of this minority handing a facsimile of liberation down from above to people, and Draper argues there's always been another subterranean tradition of socialism from below, which takes self-emancipation as its central guiding principle, and argues that its socialism is ultimately about the transcending of state power. It's also about transcending alienated forms of social power, whether that be the market or the state.
Yeah.
And so the most thorough radical democracy in all spheres of society. And so rather than seeing the measure of socialism as what percentage of the economy is owned by the state or something like that, rather it's about creating a society which has thoroughly been democratized, which allows people to democratically plan to, among other things, reduce the work week, as you were referring to. So for me, I would identify with that tradition of socialism from below. And so I think there's one way of thinking about the word the term eco-socialism can be used to refer to, for some people, what I would call green social democracy.
Mm-hmm.
A whole series of social reforms, ecological reforms, which are maybe desirable, but which don't actually do more than regulate capitalism. And then another version of eco-socialism would be to say that it's what's aimed for is a kind of an ecological version of something like what existed in the former Soviet Union or China or Cuba.
Right.
I don't think those were actually socialist societies. That would be another whole discussion. But the whole idea that a new state plans the economy from above. So that's another model that I would dissent from. But rather, for me, eco-socialism, I'm also happy to say ecological communism, whatever term people prefer, to get at the idea of the goal ultimately in the long run being a society that's moved beyond classes and state power, and uprooted forms of oppression, and has totally transformed the relationship between humanity and the rest of nature, all within a framework of production for need rather than for profit. So I do think that with terms like socialism and communism becoming more popular as people are looking to talk about alternatives to capitalism, that it is always important to ask, what do we mean by that? And have dialogue, because there's been a kind of we see that in the US, and I think it's fundamentally positive that there are tens of thousands of people who've joined and changed the Democratic Socialists of America into a very different kind of organization than the DSA was before. But that's come to redefine or how a lot of people identify or think about socialism, but there are other traditions as well. And I think that there's a lot of discussion that needs to be had among people concerned with climate justice about these kinds of things.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. I have to say, I myself have been really deeply ambivalent about this because I come from a theoretical tradition that says socialism means controlled by the state, right? Because that's the sort of, and a lot of sympathy for, anarchist critiques of the power of the state. And so and yet now that socialism is popular, it's like, oh, should I jump back on that bandwagon? But I really do love the whole literature on solidarity. In the US, people often use the term new economy because I think solidarity sounds too left to them. But the idea of solidarity economy is as like, let's figure out ways to meet our needs that are in alignment with ecological needs, and that aren't based on kind of the pursuit of profit or anybody being controlled by anybody else. And I just find that a very compelling idea, even though it does not have a ton of traction in the global north.
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe before we move to hear from people who've come to hear us, I'd be interested in your thoughts about ways in which people can get involved now in climate justice work. Because obviously we're in a really different place than we were in late 2019. A lot of things have changed, and I imagine in the US there's probably a lot of demoralization as a result of the meager fruits of what Biden has done on the climate front, and as well as, I mean, there's so many other things happening in society at the moment. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's really weird is that I do not feel that people are feeling the meager fruit feeling. That actually, I mean, I think it's like, hallelujah, finally something freaking happened, right? Like, I think that's how I feel about it. And yes, they are meager fruits, but there's things. So one of the things that I've been seeing, I would say, is that that there are a lot more people joining the movement. I mean, the floods in Pakistan, the hurricanes, in Florida. There's, and you said that it's been a couple years coming that, like, holy shit, the world is falling apart. We'd better do something, right? So there's a sense of, I think. I mean, I've been doing climate work for like 15 years, and those were some lonely years early on, right? Those were some lonely years where people were like, yeah, whatever, don't worry about it. I'm sure the experts will figure it out, and now I feel much less lonely, right? That there are people everywhere. And so one of my basic things that I give to people as advice for organizing is look where you are, right? In other words, like, what are the institutions in which you are embedded? What are the places where you think you have some locus of control? And so I think it's really important. So, I mean, I am much more about, I think the speed at which we have to deal with the climate crisis says, even if you're a person who doesn't believe that we're ever going to reform the state, you need to pass laws. So in other words, passing good laws and fighting bad laws, I actually think is crucially important. Electing politicians who are going to do that right now to get the speed, I think, is crucially important. And then if you're places, so some of it also, I have a whole chapter in my The Sea is Rising book about this, about find your flavor, right? Like, there are some people who love being out on the streets. Find your thing to be out on the street about. There's a lot of attention. Bill McKibben is somebody whose work I respect tremendously, and he's always kind of like, hey, everybody, here's the next thing to jump on. And there are often things that are good to jump on. So McKibben's new thing is like, let's really pay attention to the banks and how much the fossil fuel industry continues to do what it does because of the ways that they're enabled by pension systems and banks. I'm working on the pension system piece of that, but there's tons of people who are like, find one of the top 4 evil banks in your area and go after them. Go after them. If there's infrastructure, I mean, if there's infrastructure in your area that you can do work, some of the work too about sort of, stopping the expansion of any kind of infrastructure, I think is absolutely crucial. There's a fight here in Oakland near where I live that's just, they wanted to put in a coal processing terminal, and the community came together and said, absolutely not. So what I would say is, that it's a very personal question about what your own flavor is. For some people, being out on the street and disruptive work is attractive, and I think we need a lot more of that. For some people, the more sort of like lobbying kind of work is important. But whatever you do, just, you know, make sure you find a crew of people who you really enjoy being with, have each other's back, and find a piece to bite off. And then know that there's millions of us who are doing this, because I do a lot with sort of young folks just getting involved in social justice work. You know, I run a community organizer training program. And one of the things that happens when people start to realize what we're up against and how huge it is, that they often feel like, well, then who am I? I'm just doing this little thing. And you've always got to remember that your little thing is part of a much bigger thing, and that and find the place to chew and start chewing. That's my advice. What about you, David, on that? What would be your advice to somebody?
Well, I mean, so much depends on where you are, I think, and there's things that people can do in you know, every place. I guess one thing connected to this that I was kind of challenged to think about is that there's ways in which we sometimes may think, those of us who are certainly have been involved in climate justice work for a while, or people who were new to it in 2019, who came in through the climate strikes, certainly in the part of the world where I live, that was really significant. It totally changed the situation in terms of organizing.
Yeah.
That people have a sense that, okay, climate, if you support climate justice, then you have to do things about climate, but maybe a different way of thinking about it was that we probably will see future mobilizations that are, you know, like climate focused on an even bigger scale than we've seen. But then there are also going to be other kinds of social eruptions and movements that aren't starting about climate, but which are inevitably going to be connected to climate in some way, and that climate justice supporters need to be part of those.
Yeah.
Even if they're not under the banner of climate. I think there's a risk that people will wait for something that says it's climate, rather than like, and I don't know what it was like in the US in terms of how people who'd been primarily involved in climate justice activity, how they responded to the uprising in 2020 around racism, because it's when people are in motion in their millions, to be anywhere other than part of that process of self-activity, of learning, and so on, I think is really not going to help climate justice organizing at all. So it does mean that we need to be able to respond to what's happening and to be constructive participants in other social movements, and within those social movements help people to make connections to climate. And the experience, I have a little bit about it in my book, just briefly, that it really was impressed upon me was reading about what happened in France, where at the end of 2018 and into 2019, there was the so-called the Gilets jaunes or yellow vest movement, which was something that started around, the French state was bringing in a tax on diesel fuel. And then this provoked a lot of protest and quite militant, direct action, blocking of highways and so on, roundabouts, by people who were, some of them were self-employed, some of them were working class people, often in smaller centers outside Paris and other big urban centers, and sectors of the working class that had not been involved in a lot of the big anti-austerity protests of the previous years. And so it was coming from an unexpected direction, and it could have gone in an extremely reactionary direction. Yeah. You can imagine if the starting point is opposition to tax on diesel fuel by a neoliberal government. But in part because of the active participation of the left, including climate justice supporters, they were part of this and helped, people's politicization, contributed to that in a way that meant that it didn't just become something that benefited the far right at all. I mean, there are also all sorts of confused ideas inside that movement, but that they helped to bring people to the conclusion of, there's a slogan, end of the month. In other words, running out of money at the end of the month. End of the month, end of the world, same struggle, same fight, to translate it from the French. So that idea that social inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality, and the climate crisis are actually interconnected, and they need to be taken on together. That is an amazing accomplishment, right? To kind of help the politicization to go that way. And I think that we can expect all sorts of responses to the misery and suffering in people's lives that are going to go in, come in from unexpected places, and they're not going to look the way we would like them to look. Like, they're going to be all sorts of confused ideas and reactionary ideas in those eruptions because of what's happening in society. But they shouldn't be written off. If people can engage, it's enough people engage in the right ways, it's possible to shape those in different directions. I don't, just the last thing, I don't mean that there sometimes are just very right-wing reactionary social mobilizations that you can't reshape. So in Canada, we had the so-called convoy protests in early 2022, anti-vax, anti-mandate protests. And those, they did draw in some confused people who were not dyed-in-the-wool supporters of the far right, but those were fundamentally right-wing mobilizations, not kind of chaotic and contradictory, confused ones like the yellow vests in France. So we do need to be able to know the difference between something that's just going to be something that is by and for the far right, and that doesn't have any progressive potential, and something that's something that climate justice supporters could throw themselves into and be constructive participants in. So I just think there are lots of ways in which we need to prepare. To the extent that we can prepare for the unexpected, right? That is important, but kind of recognize that sometimes we're going to be doing small scale patient work that doesn't seem to be going anywhere or going very slowly. But then there will be, because of what's happening in society, these much bigger events that are unpredictable, and which we need to think about as potentially, they can contribute to advancing the cause of climate justice.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I want to just last couple words on that. Your part about the yellow vest movement was my favorite part of your book. I just thought you told that story really well. And I think of another example like that is when Superstorm Sandy hit New York City, right? That there were tons and tons of climate folk who just went into kind of that direct aid mode, right? Like, our job is to help people survive this crisis and also to help people understand the nature of the crisis. So absolutely. And it is like sort of surfing these waves, bad metaphor after talking about Sandy, but sort of like, surfing these waves of popular discontent and always trying to stay in alignment with and in solidarity with other movements, I think is really important. All right, Ash, I think we're ready.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for this very lively discussion. It's very super interesting to hear y'all's alignment, but also some of the places you disagree, and I really appreciate you kind of going deep in those spots where there is disagreement. I think, we got a question from the audience here that I think y'all did a good job answering already. They were asking, they brought up the fact that you had talked about stopping fossil fuel industry, and asked if we also need to get rid of capitalism, and if so, what we should replace it with. I feel like that got answered. Pretty well. Were there any additional thoughts folks wanted to share?
Well, I think we should do, we need to work for climate justice, which means a just transition from fossil fuels and the other sources of greenhouse gas emissions. To the question of to what extent that can be achieved under capitalism is we don't know the answer to that question. I very much hope, best case scenario, you have a huge eruption of social movements that actually forces, something like a just transition in one state, and then that becomes infectious, and it happens in lots of other places too. But there's also the possibility that an attempt to make those kinds of changes inside capitalism will lead to revolutionary crisis in a society, and a break with capitalism. That's also possible. We don't know. So, I don't think it's helpful to think about. I'll say this, because I don't think it's helpful to say it's not possible to achieve climate justice under capitalism and leave it at that, because then if you're saying there's no hope short of breaking with capitalism, that I think can be not helpful for the movement. We ultimately, I do think that, and I argue this in the book, that capitalism is inherently, ecocidal, but because of the urgency of the climate crisis, we should still try to fight for a just transition, rather than and try to win whatever can be won inside a capitalist society. But what kind of dynamic that could set off in the future is another question. But I just worry about when I hear people, some anti-capitalist analysts who say, we make a declaration that no solution to the climate crisis under capitalism. That can be potentially, I think, a limiting or a demobilizing way of thinking about it, even though it may turn out in the long run to be true.
Yeah, yeah, I really agree with that. And then there's a couple of things I think I would want to say too, is I feel like, we're coming through a period of capitalism that people call neoliberalism, which is, basically just capitalism on steroid, right? And it's the idea that like you can't regulate capital and capital can do whatever the hell it wants. And that's, that was sort of a dominant idea, starting with Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s. And it's only just really starting, I would say, to sort of lose its kind of dominance as a way of thinking in the world. And so if you want to get past capitalism, you do have to break down that way of thinking of the world and say, like, no, we need to go after these forces. And then the other thing I would say too is that, like, there's a concept in Marxism I really like, is like the commanding heights of capital. So, there's like, people have their little businesses, whatever, but it's like those really large scale capitalist actors that are the forms, they're the ones who are making the biggest, worst things happen. So thinking in the United States, like the Koch brothers, right? So much of what's making capitalism like just as truly horrible as it is are the sectors of capital that are run by the worst climate actors. So I think of fossil fuels, you think of agribusiness, you think of the banks, right? If you just take those three parts of capital and you say, to solve the climate crisis, we need to go after those three kind of centers of pro-capitalist power. So then we solve the climate crisis and we weaken capitalism at the same time. And I think that's it's a powerful opportunity. Naomi Klein in her book, I forget what it's called, I should have remembered, but anyhow, in her huge book on capitalism, she starts with this great chapter where she says that the right wing believes that to solve the climate crisis, those of us who want to solve the climate crisis are necessarily and inherently anti-capitalist, because capitalism cannot function and solve the climate crisis. And so what David and I are talking about, it's this really weird sort of in-between position that basically says capitalism is what's driving the problem. It's what's preventing the obvious solutions from happening. And in the process of fighting to save the climate, we will necessarily need to weaken capitalism. And who knows where we end up? And who knows when, David and I will be like, okay, in like 10 years, we'll like have a beer. It's just like, oh, which of us was right? Like, what kind of rupture was needed? Who knows? We don't know that. But what we do know is we need to fight the dominance of those sectors of capital that are driving the climate crisis. We can all, I think, agree on that.
I think yes and no. I mean, I want to just bring up two things. I guess one, I'm a little concerned. I guess there's the risk. What do we do about, there's all these other sections of capital too, big tech, for example. Because there are all sorts of divisions within the capitalist class. Mm-hmm. And yes, of course, there's a difference between fossil fuel companies themselves on the one hand, banks that are heavily invested in those companies on the other, and the other, there's degrees of proximity, right? Like some sections of capital are further from fossil fuels or less integrated into fossil capital than others. Yeah. Although I think often people underestimate the extent to which other parts of capital are integrated into fossil fuels. Yeah. And so that's a risk there, because of the way that so many, the financialization process has meant that so many firms, like the division between manufacturing firms and financial firms has really changed. Like so there's there are many more ways in which lots of other sectors of capital are kind of dependent in some way on the profits of what's going on with fossil fuels. But I just think we have to be careful not to think there's only one section of the capitalist class that's the fundamental problem, because that could lead to I think some unfortunate ideas about alliances with a so-called, and I would say this in quotation marks, a so-called progressive wing of the capitalist class, which is an old idea. And I don't think there is a progressive wing of the capitalist class. There are different wings, but I think it could be very dangerous for people to, I mean, in the US context, it would mean like, it's like ally with the Democratic Party on the grounds that it represents the progressive wing of capital, or parts of it do.
Yeah.
And then so that's one concern. And the other thing that I think we probably agree on is that, of course, there's a difference between capitalism and neoliberal capitalism, that capitalism existed long before there was neoliberalism, and there are ways in which we may see the development of a new way of organizing capitalism that isn't neoliberal, which doesn't necessarily mean it's any better for people and for the planet. And so I think the reports of the death of neoliberalism have often been exaggerated. A lot of people were saying after 2008 and the Great Recession, they said this was the end of neoliberal capitalism, and surprise, surprise, it was simply, state power was used to revive neoliberal capitalism, to bail out the financial system and so on. And despite the way that neoliberalism is actually, it's self-destructive, there are also ways in which it's actually a problem for capitalism, because it's the relentless short-term focus. And the whole idea that the role of the state is simply to dismantle barriers to corporate profit, which is the idea, a neoliberal idea. That's actually a problem for visionary, long-term people thinking about the future of capitalism, who are supporters of the system. They actually realize that that's not, good for them. They've failed to bring about any other kind of transition. But we do need to be, without leaping at things that aren't sufficient evidence, we do need to be open to the possibility that there can be, in response to economic crisis like the coming recession and in response to ecological problems and the climate crisis, we may begin to see in some places the development of capitalism being organized in a somewhat different way, with the state playing a more active role. And that, that would be different and than neoliberal capitalism, and not a sign that we're going beyond capitalism.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks for that exchange.
Like, oh, is there nothing more to say on this? It's like, no, we can talk forever.
I want to encourage folks who are in the audience that if you want to ask a question, that would be the time to do it. And in the meantime, I guess I'm curious to ask, we're having you here this week, in which, and this sort of relates to some of what David was talking about with social movements and their potential to really sort of like influence / force change, force a situation to bring about that change. So I want to ask sort of about the status of climate justice movements, social movements, to be able to apply that kind of pressure. And often there are actions that get a lot of attention from the media, right? So this week I'm thinking about the 2 young people who threw the can of sauce on the painting. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on those kinds of actions for their relationship to achieving the kinds of goals you're talking about and building movements. And at the same time, I'm also curious to hear about, if not that, or if that isn't really the kind of solution or the kind of movement building that's needed, what examples that are currently happening do you look to as sort of like the front lines of the climate justice movement? And perhaps here I'm interested, in the United States, feels like a while ago, but we had Standing Rock and No Dapple that was very galvanizing. I know in Canada, there are lots of Indigenous movements pushing back against pipelines and land back and things like that. So I guess that's a big question, kind of like a 2-parter. What are your thoughts on some of the more flashier activism and stunts that happen, and how do you feel like that relates to some of the frontline organizing that's happening?
Yeah, there's a ton to say. Okay, so I think it's really important to understand how complex and multifaceted social movements are. One of my favorite books on this is by a guy named Bill Moyer, not the TV guy Bill Moyers, but Bill Moyer. It's called Doing Democracy. And one of the things that he talks about is this idea that social movements have lots of phases, they have lots of parts, they take forever. There can be times when you're doing work and everybody says you're crazy, nobody's listening to you, and then there are other times where you capture people's imagination. So I think it's really important to sort of be really supportive of the multiplicity of approaches that people take, and to think about synergy between different kinds of actors. And I think that there's a way that how can I say this? There's a way that people who sort of work within the bounds of kind of what's considered acceptable and normal and proper often sort of get mad at people who do things that are a little bit more militant, and say like, oh, we're losing, we're losing support because you did that. But it turns out one of my favorite books is Poor People's Movements by Cloward and Piven. And in that book, they talk about in the US in the mid 20th century, poor people got things when they rioted. And I'm not saying therefore go out and riot, because you actually can't just like choose a riot. But the point is that when people in a system are, people join movements because they like them and they believe in them, they support them, or politicians respond to movements sometimes because they like them and sometimes because they're afraid of them. So I don't want to and so I think often, and it's interesting, after the thing happened with the soup on the painting, that apparently they were very careful that it was not going to wreck the painting, which I really appreciate that, because I don't believe in wrecking art. But so I actually read a whole bunch about that, and there was this sort of actual like social movement geeks kind of like where some people were saying, that turns people away from the movement, and other people like, nah, read your scholarship. That's actually not true. I mean, because sometimes something which is flashy like that actually gets people's attention. They're like, oh, I wouldn't do that, but I would do this other thing. So it pulls them into that other thing. So it's actually a very complicated and dynamic. And I think it's important for us in movements to be careful to criticize others in movements, and to have that kind of that idea of synergy between the different parts of movements. And so I think you do want to think about your messaging. You do want to think about what's going to build support for what you do, but you also don't want to be afraid of having people not like you, because sometimes when the system is afraid, that's actually when you get reforms.
So yeah, I think it's helpful to think about, I mean, it gets overused, but social movements, as can be thought of as kind of as ecosystems. So there are a range of different things that are going on. When you have something which is a genuine social movement, and I try to, in the book, to clarify that I think there's a tendency to overuse the term social movement, where we just see a bunch of people doing something and call it a social movement, whereas just a real movement is actually much larger than that. And it's not helpful if you call small protests and so on a social movement, because then you don't understand what is really different and important about a movement, especially a mass social movement. And so I think we can recognize that there's complexity and different strands within a movement, and different kinds of politics that sometimes are moving in the same direction and sometimes can effectively work together, and other times are working at cross purposes, or can be in conflict with each other. So that in the run up to the big climate strikes, the student climate strikes in September of 2019, there were a whole certainly range of different kinds of people working for together for that common objective. But once those specific days of action had come and gone, many of the differences then began to emerge. And so those kind of things need to be thought about. And we can, I think, recognize both that there's that kind of complexity, but also, and that these things can be synergistic, but that doesn't mean that all strategies are always equally good or equally effective. Right. So I think that's part of the challenge. In terms of the stunts and stuff, I'll just mention there's actually the British online publication, The Ecologist, ran a short piece by an organizer named Harry Holmes about the specific action with the throwing the tomato soup that I thought was good. And if I recall it right, he was essentially saying that people should stop the hand wringing about this. At the same time, this is not what's going to build the social movements with the power that we need to win a just transition, these kinds of actions by small numbers of individuals. But that, we shouldn't be getting all upset about it or something like that either. And then in terms of Ash, what you were saying about Indigenous struggles, I do think this is important for those of us, particularly in what I would call settler colonial North America, that there's a way in Indigenous struggles have a specificity that is really important. That because of where Indigenous peoples who are living in particular frontline areas, are ways in which fossil fuel extraction expansion collides with Indigenous people and the defense of their traditional territories. Like that there's something that's very important about that, and also ways in which Indigenous people have been less, I guess, like the hegemony of fossil capitalist ideology is weaker among Indigenous people than it is among non-Indigenous people. So there's also an element of consciousness that's there. Well, of course, we have to recognize that large numbers of Indigenous people live in urban areas. That it's not just about people in these other rural spaces, but there's a way in which those struggles can be very important for slowing or blocking the development of fossil fuel. So kind of slowing or trying to block the rate of destruction. But there's also a way in which those struggles can then spark much broader mobilizations. And we saw this certainly with the Dakota Access Pipeline in the US, and then with the Wet'suwet'en struggle, which happened, it's still ongoing in the province of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. But the struggle of the Wet'suwet'en people under their traditional leadership against the pipeline construction connected to liquefied natural gas exports. That's part of the big development out there. It was amazing to see how in early 2020, when that was at its peak here, so many people who've been involved in the climate strike in late 2019 flowed into the Indigenous solidarity work. And I think there's a way in which, that was very important. A lot of people non-Indigenous people who were doing that weren't just trying to materially help that struggle by blocking railways or streets or whatever else they were doing, but there was also a way in which they were calling into question or beginning to question the society that we live in. And because a challenge to settler colonialism is very, no pun intended, it's very unsettling for these societies that we live in, because capitalism was built through settler colonialism in this part of the world. And so land back and those other kinds of demands coming out of Indigenous movements have very radical implications. They call into question the social order in profound ways, and so they can be, they're both very important in and of themselves, and then they also have all sorts of implications, political implications that go far beyond them. And so I do think that they are really important. And so the learning that climate justice supporters need to do about Indigenous struggle, the active support that we need to lend to it, this I think is important in how we go forward. And we can expect that, and I'll just wrap it up because I realize I've gone on a long time about this, but if we're seeing the beginnings of a recession, that recession is going to get deeper. So as the pressures on profits are greater, there will be new attempts to extract. Right, there are going to be new fossil fuel projects that will probably be undertaken, or pressures to move in that way, and therefore we can expect an intensification of moves to dispossess Indigenous people from their remaining traditional and other territories. And so that means we can predict, I think, more confrontations between Indigenous people and fossil fuel extraction and the state power that's backing up those fossil fuel companies. So I think there's going to be more of this, and so it becomes more important than it's been ever before to really think about the connections between Indigenous struggles against settler colonialism and the struggle for climate justice.
want to throw in one tiny thought, which is just, I realized when David was talking about that we haven't been talking about race very much. And I just wanted to say that, that I've gotten really clear in my own mind that when we talk about capitalism, we mean racial capitalism, right? In other words, that capitalism has been about dispossession, racism, dehumanization kind of since the very beginning. And so then all the work, like when David was talking about the sort of coalitional work, like joining other struggles, you think about when George Floyd was murdered in this country, that the sort of the devaluation and dehumanization of Black lives is part of the capitalist process, right? You don't want to just reduce that to capitalism and say it's just a class thing, but it is also true that a huge part of what we're trying to get past when we try to build a kind of a sustainable world is that we want a world where everybody matters and everybody's needs matter, and that a huge part of capitalism is the exploitation of labor and then the hyper exploitation of the bodies of people of color and the land of indigenous peoples. I just wanted to I just wanted to say that because it just struck me that it hadn't really been said.
Really appreciate those answers and the depth y'all went. I think that was helpful. And I think it connects to our next question here from Greg, who asks, besides the capitalist economic system, do you also critique the political systems that we have? So representative democracy, parliamentary democracy, and they then go on to say, would the political system of Rojava in northeast Syria, presently the political system they use, be something which we might be able to learn from? And I'm just going to tack on, right? We have featured lots of events this year on sort of the revitalization of a lot of Murray Bookchin's work and social ecology, and which is also related to and linked with some of the work and the revolution that's happening in Rojava. So yeah, I guess how do you, the vision that you all work for within the climate justice movement, how does that feel related to kind of more directly democratic participatory movements, like the democratic confederalism we see in northeast Syria, and some of the sort of like municipalist movements that are gaining momentum in different places in the world?
David, why don't you take that one first, and then I want to go for it too. It's a great question. I love it.
Okay, so on the general question, maybe I should have been clearer. So I think that I don't think capitalism is just an economic system. I think that we often think about it that way, but we think about it in terms of private firms. But I think actually capitalism is a way of organizing society that includes how state power, the political system, if you like, is organized. And so it's you can think about capitalism as a social order, which has different dimensions to it, or different spheres, and an economic sphere and a political sphere, which can be related in different kinds of ways. So people sell their ability to work in exchange for wages and give up control, in the economic sphere. When they do that, people, we, the majority of society, produce a society, but we actually don't control it. We're dominated by the products of our own labor. But at the same time, as we are ruled politically, and we're subject to these political institutions, those institutions of state power, that are also alienated. We don't control them any more than we control workplaces. They're completely, with the exception of the moment when you vote, there's no democracy, there's no democratic control on an ongoing basis over those institutions. So it's a very capitalist democracy, which is, to be clear, preferable to forms of capitalism where you have no democracy at all. Capitalist democracy is a very thin form of democracy. So I think that we should think about, what people might call the political system as part of capitalism, and recognizing there's obviously a big difference between fascist states, other forms of completely undemocratic states, and then forms of capitalist democracy that are, at their best, still very minimal, and often today are becoming even less democratic than they were before. So that's one thing. And then on the specific question of Rojava, I don't know enough to have a strong, I don't want to venture a strong position about that. because I just haven't read enough. I'm a little concerned by what I think sometimes is a romanticization that I sort of, it seems to me, I've picked up in some things that I've seen about this, which is not to dismiss the significance of what's been done or is still happening there. But I do think that we need to, learn about what's going on, and to do that from a range of sources that, not just those that are directly closely aligned with the, the political leadership in that place. So I don't really think I have more that I can say about that.
Yeah, and I've had a couple of students who are really into, and we're all pronouncing it differently. I've always said Rojava, so I have no idea the proper way and of course we'd be anglicizing it anyway, with the proper way to anglicize Rojava. But anyway, what I've read about it, it's really exciting. One of the things I love about it is how deeply feminist it is. Like, it seems, and I also agree with David, it's just like, and are we projecting our fantasies? Right? Zapatista movement, amazing, amazing, amazing. And then all of a sudden everybody was like, this is the thing, right? So just a little caution on that. But everything I've read is like, yeah, what an amazing model. And yes, of course, David and I have been saying this, that capitalism is a political and economic system. Totally agree with that. Now I want to kind of geek out here just for a couple minutes, which is that I have another book called Challenging Power, in which I really put out this idea of what I call accountability democracy. Because I think there's a way that sometimes when people talk about, especially like in anarchist circles, it's sort of like, are you for or against the state, or sort of socialists? It's like, oh, we don't want a capitalist state, we want a socialist state. And I was so interested in kind of like how sterile those conversations had felt to me for years. And so again, I sort of like stepped back, spent 5 years reading and thinking, and feel now what I want to say is like, power has a tendency to accumulate. There are many places where power gets, where you get situations where some people are able to kind of dominate and control the world. States are a place where power gets compressed and accumulated. And so to me, then what I want to say is the kind of for me, the concept of accountability democracy says wherever power is concentrated, you need to hold it to account. So you can't just say like, oh, there's this, bad capitalist, parliamentary democracy thing. Let's do our own thing, which is good. It's like, when you create your own thing, you had better be watching about how power accumulates, because whenever people are in a situation to make decisions, they accumulate power. And over again, the left makes the same mistake of thinking that when the good guys are in power, everything's going to be fine, right? And you have to say, like, what are the mechanisms you're setting up to make it such that the power is held to account and it doesn't accumulate? So that's where I want to say parliamentary democracy could work, if there wasn't so much money involved in it, if there were mechanisms to keep people's voices there. So what I always want to look at, it's not so much like what's the form of government or governance or social organization that's good, but what are you've got to just kind of keep your eyes always on what are the things you're going to do to keep power from accumulating in ways that it's not accountable. I don't know if that's a wishy-washy answer, but that's yeah.
Appreciate that. Well, great. I think we're coming to the end of our time together. This has been a robust discussion. Again, I've really appreciated not only the places in which there's been alignment and clarity, but also the degree to which we've been open to disagreeing with one another and to name those disagreements. I think that can be just as important as the places in which we see that, in which we're in agreement and see our shared work. So just want to thank you both for taking the time tonight.
Can I just say, I just want one last thought on that. We need to take ourselves seriously, right? You know what I'm saying? In other words, I feel like a lot of leftists, both Marxists and anarchists, whatever school you're in, we've been coasting on old thoughts. We are at a crisis. We need change. Like we need to take ourselves seriously. And so I just hope we're entering a period where people really ask these kinds of questions that we're asking, because it's crucial. So yeah, anyway, thanks.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. My sense from people I know in the US is that, morale has really, taken a beating compared to where things were at a couple of years ago. And people need to recognize that movements go through ebbs and flows, and that it's important in moments like this not to be consumed with. There can be a tendency towards turning inwards, and intensification of sectarianism, and denunciation and so on, which is not going to be helpful. And I don't want to underestimate the difficulties that people face in the U.S. because they're even worse than what people face where I am. But yeah, we do need to find ways to have. The word gets overused and can be abused, but I do think we need to try to foster a spirit of comradely discussion where people can actually argue for what they believe, and do that, which some ways sometimes is quite pointed, maybe more pointed even than we've been tonight, but that's not just abusive, and where the aim is actually, as much as possible, to be constructive and to move forward the struggles that we need to be building, given the enormous stakes and the enormous threats to people that we face.
Well said.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for Firestorm.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for taking the time being with us. And thank you to the audience who came and also asked some really great questions. I did just drop links to both David's new book, Future on Fire, and Cynthia's most recent work, The Sea is Rising and So Are We. So if folks haven't picked up copies yet, it's a great way to support these writers, organizers, as well as Firestorm, and also to continue learning and staying engaged in this movement, which is of the utmost importance. And yeah, anyone who registered for this event will get a follow-up email with a link to watch it again. So there was a lot covered here tonight. If you want to check out the event again, you'll be able to in a few days.
All right, thanks.
And yeah,
Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, y'all, and I hope you have a good night.
Bye.
Goodbye now.